Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. As always, we have several hundred people joining. So I'm going to give it another minute or two to give people time to get on before we start the call. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm going to give it another couple minutes, well, maybe one more minute, and then we'll get started. Thanks. Okay, hi, everybody. This is Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for joining today's call on coronavirus, disasters, housing, and homelessness, our weekly call from the National Income Housing Coalition. We have a really full agenda and we have a great group of speakers. I want to start just by reminding us all that we are now 38 days from the expiration of the CDC eviction moratorium. And clearly that, we are facing the very real possibility of no new emergency rental assistance provided by that time that the eviction moratorium expires. And at that point, we could face the possibility of tens of millions of people losing their homes in the dead of winter and during a peak of a COVID-19 spike, the consequences of which clearly would be catastrophic for families, for kids, for communities, for our country's ability to contain the pandemic. So it's an outcome that we can't allow. And there are many, I just want to remind us all of all the things that we can be doing right now to prevent that outcome. So one is, of course, to remember that the CDC eviction moratorium, however flawed, is keeping many, many people who would otherwise lose their homes housed. And we still need to be getting the word out to as many renters as possible that the eviction moratorium is in effect until the end of December, and to let renters know what they need to do in order to get that protection. So a reminder that on our website, we have a fact sheet and the declarative statement on the moratorium. We have it in English and we've translated it into 13 languages. So you can access that there. Please utilize it, get it out. If you're a renter, if you're an organizer and you need copies of those in any languages, just send us an email, put something in the chat box now, let us know. We'll copy and we'll mail those to you so that you have them to share with your neighbors, with your community. The other thing that we need to all be doing is urging governors and mayors to act now. Governors and mayors shouldn't be waiting for the federal government to act to protect renters in their state and their city. They should go ahead and assume that the federal government's not going to act in time and think about what they need to do now to protect renters. So we're urging all governors and mayors to re-implement or reinstitute state or citywide eviction moratoriums. Colorado and North Carolina are leading the way. The governors, after many months of an eviction moratorium having been expired, they reinstituted new eviction moratoriums. So we have a lot further to go. We need a lot more mayors and governors to do the same. We're urging everybody, of course, to spend all available funds for emergency rental assistance. So we've been tracking, as you all know, we've been tracking emergency rental assistance programs. we've been tracking their funding sources, we're becoming increasingly concerned that there's over $360 million that is unspent, that are coronavirus relief fund dollars that are at risk of being swept back to the federal government when there's an expiration on spending those funds at the end of the year. So also do what you can to urge your state and local governments to spend those funds and to target what, of course, are limited resources to those who are at greatest risk of being evicted in the short term. And that is, of course, the lowest income and the most marginalized renters. And of course, we have to keep pushing Congress to do more to enact a final COVID relief package. And we'll talk a little bit more in the call about what we're hearing on that and what more you all can be doing. And we have joining our call a member of Congress herself, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who I think we are still working on getting onto the line. So let me just double check that and see. Yes, I believe Congresswoman Barbara Lee is not quite on the line. We're working on it. I think we're having some technical difficulties. So in the meantime, I will also mention what's the last item on the agenda for today, which is working with and engaging President-elect Biden's transition team. So we've heard from some of you some questions about how that works and what we're doing and what others can be doing. So one of the first things that President-elect Biden did, that all president-elects do after the election, is create what are called agency review teams, or they're sometimes known as landing teams. And they are teams of people who are responsible for getting to know everything about each federal department. So in the case of housing, there is a landing team assigned to HUD. And that team, pre-COVID would physically be going into the building of HUD. And now during COVID, they're doing it virtually. They're meeting with HUD staff. They're figuring out kind of where are the vacancies, where are the challenges, what are the things that they would want to quickly overturn in a new administration or implement in a new administration, what are the things they would want to carry through. So that agency review team is really putting together a first day and a first 100 days of action for the incoming president. And if you haven't seen it, the landing team, the agency review team for HUD is terrific. It's made up of a really talented, knowledgeable, dedicated group of people, lots of familiar names, lots of friends. Maybe somebody from the NLHC team can put the link to the landing team in the chat box so you can all see it. But it's a great group of experts, which in and of itself is a relief and notable that this administration is signaling that they value expertise, which is a bit of a change from the previous administration, or the current, I should say, administration. So that group is putting together the early policy agenda for the incoming administration. What they're also doing in order to come up with that agenda, in addition to talking with HUD staff, they're reaching out to stakeholders. And they have hit the ground running. At NLHC, we've been part of at least 5 conversations with the transition team, with the agency review teams. Conversations sort of by topic on homelessness, on the eviction crisis, on emergency rental assistance, on long-term housing needs, on community development, and on some other topics. So they're reaching out to stakeholders. We're having a lot of conversations with them, and we are giving them input from all of you, from the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. So one of the things that we're urging on the first day of action is for President Biden to implement a new eviction moratorium. And I will share a little bit more about that momentarily, but first I just want to double check. I think the Congresswoman is on now. Congresswoman Lee, are you on the line? Let me just double check this. It looks like
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, I can hear you, Congresswoman. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, glad to be with you. I enjoyed listening to your update. Good information, and thank you guys so much. My phone is going in and out, so I hope that you can hear me, and I'll be very brief, but just thank you all, not only for inviting me to be with you for a few minutes, but what you're doing each and every day on behalf of affordable housing for everyone, because housing is a basic human right, and you're keeping that front and center, not only in the Congress, but with the Biden administration. Of course, you know, I represent the 13th Congressional District. In our region, in California, and specifically the Bay Area, we face some of the largest barriers to housing access and affordability in the nation. And so I'm no stranger to this fight for the right to quality, affordable housing for all. And I think what you're doing and how you're moving forward so assertively and aggressively, making sure that the eviction moratorium is preserved, and everything else that you're doing in terms of looking at comprehensive for our unsheltered individuals, for those who are living on the edge, is remarkable. We're facing this unprecedented affordable housing and homelessness crisis, and we've been facing this long before the pandemic. And so now we're looking at all of these pre-existing inequalities that are further exacerbated by COVID-19. We're on the verge, as you know, of an eviction tsunami. We're reminded that housing really can be a matter of life and death. And so we've got to act with the understanding that a housing affordability, it's not only an economic crisis, is not only the right thing to do, but it's a public health and safety crisis also. And I support, of course, the emergency rental assistance funds, especially for our very low-income renter households. We have put into the HEROES Act the $100 billion to emergency rental assistance program that funds housing relocation and stabilization. And also, I'm really proud to support Representative Garcia's bill to expand existing federal eviction bans to all tenants, not just those receiving federal assistance. But I tell you, this HEROES Act, we have got to pass it. And you know the status of it. We've come down from over $3 trillion to a bit over $2 trillion. So don't let anyone say to you that Democrats don't want to make sure we do something and do something quickly. We're doing everything we can do. Mitch McConnell and his crowd, of course, said that they wanted to put a pause in federal stimulus to see how the prior CARES Act worked. And that's wrong, because right now we're facing matters of life and death for the most vulnerable. And so we're going to try everything we can, every tool in our toolbox, to try to get this stimulus done before the end of the year, because people can't wait. We can't wait. And thank you all so much for your advocacy and for your support for the people who don't actually have a voice, or who are just living from day to day on the edges, and looking to you to make sure that they have a decent quality of housing that's healthy and safe for themselves and their children. So thank you all again.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Lee. We appreciate your leadership so much. You know, you have been a lifelong champion for ending poverty and homelessness, and as chair of the Task Force on Poverty and Opportunity, you've led 100 members of Congress in advancing legislation to lift people out of poverty. You've frequently partnered with us and introduced resolutions on that floor of the House, talking about housing as a human right. So it's exciting now to have an administration coming into office who has adopted that frame that you have really pioneered, talking about housing as a human right. And you're absolutely right that this emergency rental assistance and all of the housing and homelessness provisions from the HEROES Act are just essential and so urgently needed. Is there anything more that you think we can be doing, or what kind of advice or guidance would you give to us to just keep holding members of Congress accountable and keep pushing them to pass the HEROES Act at last?
Sure. Short term, that's what we have to do. And I think we have to focus on the Senate. And I always say when I talk to the president, and Republican senators have people who are unsheltered, people living below the poverty line, people who are poor, and people who are just barely living on the edge. And so I think helping us focus on the Senate is short term what we must do. Long term, I believe we have to fight for the elimination of poverty and fight for those bills, those pieces of legislation that I have introduced and other members as the chair of the Majority Task Force on Poverty and Opportunity, and work with Bishop Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, because all of this intersects with poverty and the most vulnerable. So I think what you're doing now is absolutely what needs to be done. And then next year, let's talk about a comprehensive strategy to put forth a comprehensive bill that's going to address the unsheltered, affordable housing, homelessness, as well as reducing and eliminating poverty.
Absolutely. As you've said, I've got one of your quotes in front of me here saying that ending poverty in the world's richest and most powerful nation is a moral and economic imperative. And we couldn't agree more. We're so grateful for your leadership. And thank you so much for joining today's call, Congresswoman Lee.
Okay. Thank all of you for staying the course. Please stay healthy, stay safe, and follow the health protocols. Don't listen to what's coming out of the White House, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you again. Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah, I mean, Congresswoman Lee has just been such a decades-long champion for all of this work. We're really lucky to have her leading the fight in the House from many of these issues that we're all working on. And before I turn to our next speakers, I just want to go back to what I was saying about the President-elect Biden and the eviction moratorium. So we have been making the case with the transition teams about how essential it will be for President-elect Biden on his first day of office, on one of his first actions in office, to sign into effect a new federal eviction moratorium, because at that point we might be 3 weeks into a lapsed eviction moratorium. So, and we've been doing that work together with the National Housing Law Project and Eviction Lab, and we've put out a fact sheet on it that we can share with you all, and it's in NLIHC's transition memo, which we've already shared with you. So good. The good news is that we are hearing now, and the New York Times yesterday is reporting that the transition team and the president-elect are considering making an announcement sometime soon about their intention to do just that, to implement a new eviction moratorium on the president-elect's first day of office. So that will be good news. It will be welcomed and much needed. And we'll certainly let you all know, or you'll hear maybe before we do, even if the president-elect makes that announcement. But somebody asked in the chat box, what about between now and then? And what, if anything, is President Trump doing on eviction moratoriums? And I would say that he's doing nothing. And the person who asked the question asked me to please not be biased in my answer. And I can promise you that it is a nonpartisan, non-biased answer to say that President Trump is doing nothing to extend the eviction moratorium. He's shown no interest in doing so. But there are some within his administration, and I believe some within the CDC, who are interested in the possibility of extending it. So I think we've shared before, we are having conversations with people at the CDC, at HHS, pretty much anybody we can talk to urge them to go ahead and extend that eviction moratorium on their own. The CDC, of course, is the director of the CDC is a political appointee, but the CDC sometimes acts independently from the White House. And so we're urging them to do that now. And we'll certainly keep you all posted if we make any progress there. So, okay, we're going to turn now to some of our next speakers. And I'll say the next few topic areas where we asked people to speak to, it's really to share just how challenged we are as a country right now because there has been no COVID relief, and all of it really to inform us and help with our advocacy to keep making the case. So I encourage you all to really listen, take notes, ask questions on what you hear today, and then just feed that information right back to your members of Congress around the urgency that they act. So first, we're going to hear about some new research on growing back rent during the pandemic. We've heard a few different estimates on this call. Today, I'm really glad to have on the line Davin Reed and Eileen Divringi, who are with the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia to talk about their latest research. So Davin and Eileen, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak with everyone here today. So my name is Davin Reed, and I'm at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and I wrote this report with Eileen Divringi, and I will spend about 5 minutes just kind of setting up what we did, and then Eileen will spend the last couple minutes talking about some of the policy implications, and then we'll be glad to take any questions, and we'll have our email address at the end if you'd like to follow up. So yes, this report is exactly trying to estimate the amount of back rent that might be owed once these eviction moratoriums expire, whenever they eventually do. They've kind of all made clear thus far that whatever rent has accumulated during this period will still be owed, right? And yet, it's very hard to come up with accurate numbers of what those amounts might be, but it's critical to understanding how much additional help these households might need. Right? Income replacement policies have been in place, for example, unemployment insurance, but we know that not everyone receives those things. And it's really unclear to how much remaining need might be out there. So how much additional help may be needed and for whom? So our approach is to use data on a nationally representative sample of people who are working before COVID-19. And we see things about their industries and their occupations. We understand how much individuals are making and also how much their household is paying in rent. And then we're also going to bring in data on other household spending and savings. And that's going to let us simulate job losses according to kind of what is happening to aggregate employment. In March, April, as millions of people are losing their jobs, we can assign people job losses and recalculate their incomes after they've lost these jobs to understand, how much that pushes households into debt and for how long, and then therefore how much debt they may be accumulating. And we're going to do this under different scenarios about what sort of policy help they may be receiving. And that's going to let us forecast a lot of these numbers forward, for example, to the end of this year, and then into next year, and then to update it as well as new policies are kind of put out there. A couple key caveats is that first, we're excluding financial distress that may have existed before the pandemic, right? So as we all know, there's just a general background of housing instability and need. And there are eviction lab estimates of in a typical year what that need looks like, anywhere from 2.5 to 3.6 million eviction filings per year in a typical year. So you can think of our numbers as kind of what you might want to add to that sort of background level. And we're also specifically, the dollar amounts we're talking about are those specifically going towards rent, right? So it's not all lost income. It's really, if someone were to appear in court in January, what would their landlord potentially say that they are owed? All right, so big picture, we're going to have about 32 million renter households working before COVID-19. And then we're going to have about 24% of them lose a job between March and August 2020, right? Which is about 7.5 million households. And so what we do, each of these panels is kind of showing a different debt outcome. For example, the top left is the share of all renter households with any debt. And then each line within these panels represents a different policy scenario. So in the top left panel, the green line is under a scenario in which no one received any income replacement. The share of households with debt would spike pretty quickly to about 10% and stay there through most of the end of the year. By contrast, the red line is showing if every household were to receive CARES UI and economic impact payments, that number would stay quite low, right? Which might be expected given that UI with the CARES provisions was exactly designed to replace pretty much most lost income for most households. So the key question then is which share of households are receiving different policies? So we can look in the census survey data on UI recipiency, and we basically get a national estimate that about 50% of households losing jobs end up getting CARES. And that lets us calculate these scenarios, which we think of as our likely scenarios. So the green line here is that scenario, and it's kind of showing over each month how the share of households with debt is evolving. And then at the end of the day, how much total debt might be owed and how much debt a household may be owed. That leads to some of our kind of headline numbers, which is that by December of this year, about 1.3 million households will have some rent debt. That's about 3.9 million individuals, and 4% of all renter households, right? And the average debt among those households will be about $5,400, which is about 5 months of back rent in our data. The next thing we do is that we can take this likely scenario, the green line from the previous slide, and we can break this out by different demographic characteristics. So we first break it out by race ethnicity, and you can see, for example, that Hispanic households are most likely to be in debt by December, followed by Black and other non-white households, and then lastly, white and Asian households. We do something similar by family type. We find that particularly female-headed households with children are most likely to experience rental debt by the end of the year. And all of these results, right, are consistent with the story that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted employment among these types of households. And now I'll turn it over to Eileen, who can wrap up some of the policy implications.
Thanks, Evan. So just to recap some of the major findings from our report. So we find that there's about 1.3 million renter households who we estimate will owe at least some back rent by the time the current CDC eviction moratorium expires. And again, that's not even considering the households who are at risk of owing back rent due to non-pandemic related reasons. So this is really specific to the pandemic related job losses figure. Additionally, we estimate that they'll owe a little over $5,000 in back rent on average. And it's worth noting that these households include 3.9 million individuals and 1.1 million children, who we often think of as being kind of particularly vulnerable to some of the risks associated with housing instability. So there's a couple, sorry, if we could go back a slide. So there's a couple of just very quick policy takeaways I want to point to. And perhaps I'll focus on the one that might be most relevant to folks on this call, especially those who are involved with some of the advocacy around the state CARES programs. But one thing that's important to note from our research is that a lot of the households that are in the most challenged positions are ones who had a lot of difficulty signing up for unemployment insurance, right? Either they didn't quite meet the eligibility requirements or they weren't able to sort of get through the application process. So it's really important to be sensitive to these sort of administrative barriers. There's a lot of states that had difficulty getting kind of CARES Act money out the door because they designed programs that were actually pretty hard for a lot of low-income and distressed tenants to access. So that's one that I want to highlight. And then the other one that I want to highlight is that this this 5,000 number is really big, bigger than what we see as the sort of normal back rent owed in kind of normal times for folks who are facing eviction. So that really speaks to the need for kind of dedicated rental relief. And with that, we're happy to answer questions in the Q&A and the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, that's very helpful. And I would just call everybody's attention to the chat box where Eileen put some helpful links and comments. And anybody who has questions, chat is fine, or you can put it in the Q&A. Jerry's asking a question now about whether the Federal Reserve, oh wait, I just lost it. Whether the Federal Reserve Bank has taken a position on extending CARES Act funding. And I think Jerry's referring to the deadline for unspent funds that put some of those funds at risk of being swept back to Treasury.
Unfortunately, we're not able to comment on kind of specific policies.
Yeah, okay. And I wanted to ask, this is really helpful. Thank you for doing it and for presenting it. And the estimates that you've come up with are actually pretty significantly more conservative than some other estimates that are out there by Stout and Mark Zandi and some others that have had much higher estimates of back rent owed. And of course, that's because of the way that they come up with the estimates. But I think what some other economists have done is use the Census Pulse survey and consider the number of people who self-report that they are challenged or expect to be challenged in paying the rent, or that they haven't been able to pay the rent in the past. And so just would ask you to say a little bit more about how you determined how you would come up with the estimates, what standards you would use to estimate the back rent.
Yes, so you're right that the surveys often come up with much higher numbers of estimated need. And I think so one of the big, I wouldn't say problems, but a challenge with doing that is that it's not doing something that we are doing, which is separating need before the pandemic to need after the pandemic. Because I mean, obviously the Census Pulse survey itself was implemented, because of COVID-19 to study need during COVID-19. But there's nothing pre-COVID to compare against. And so, for example, I think a thing that's probably familiar to many people on the call is the NMHC rent tracker, which, some of the first numbers showing, once COVID started, saying, how many people weren't paying rent on time, the number was quite high. But then if you compared it to what it was like a year ago, it hadn't actually increased that much. So the analogy would be our study is really showing how much the increase was relative to a baseline, whereas the surveys are really saying just what is the need from any sort of source. And so, and specifically what we're doing is literally we're looking at our data and we observe how much people are making and what sort of industries and occupations they're working in. And then we have data from the CES on how many people actually lost jobs in different industries and occupations and in certain states. And then so we can say, for example, that if 20% of people lost a job in a given industry in a given state, we will actually assign 20% of the people in our data a job loss, right? And we'll prioritize job losses in certain industries and among certain types of workers who are at higher risk. And then we'll say now 20% of people have lost a job. How much income did they lose? Therefore, how many of them now have less income, than they pay in rent and other necessary expenses, and that's how we're arriving at our numbers. And so, one of the reasons I think also our number isn't as high as it kind of could be is that employment has come back a little bit since the worst parts of March and April, and so that's another reason. We do find some people moving back into employment, and therefore not as likely to be at risk. Some of the very early suggested. And just building in unemployment insurance in really a rich way, which we've tried to do, and just acknowledging the fact that, for those people who got it, CARES was very, very successful. And that's a credit to, everyone who got those laws passed. But, it did replace a lot of income for people who lost jobs. The problem is just that not everyone gets it, right? And that they expire and that some people still need help. So that's kind of a lot of what we think the next policy needs to be thinking about. But
right,
thanks for the opportunity to explain that, because I know a lot of people have questions about that.
Yeah, that's very helpful answer. Thank you. And I do have to say that the NMHC rent tracker is very problematic and flawed.
That's fair. That's great. Yes.
Yeah, because it's capturing a certain segment of the rental
That's right.
population, which is the least likely to be struggling right now. It's the professionally owned property. I can never miss an opportunity to point that out.
It's important. It's definitely important to keep in mind. Yes.
Yeah, and there's Sarah Philbrick asked a question about if you can explain how you determined other necessary expenses in quotes across the country for the study.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Eileen actually did most of the legwork on that. So Eileen, do you want to field that?
Yeah, so we sort of, and this is a great question. I mean, this is definitely something that's challenging because the expenses for a given household are going to vary so much household to household. Essentially what we did is we looked at the kind of methodology underlying the living wage calculator, the MIT living wage calculator. Some folks might be familiar with that, and looked at sort of the non-housing expenses that are typical of households, estimated kind of sort of in that tool, how they estimated in that tool. And we assumed a certain amount, that households would be able to cut back a certain amount on how much they spend. And so we sort of built that assumption into the model. But it is admittedly sort of a sort of not particularly sophisticated way of estimating household expenses. We do it based on the household size, which sort of helps compensate a little bit for different expenditure needs across households, but it was sort of based on a relatively fixed assumption about how much people would need to spend to cover their basic non-housing expenses.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you. And somewhat related, there's a question about whether when you refer to rent, do you mean the lease only, or are you including related costs like electricity and gas?
So technically we used gross rent and not contract rent, right?
Yes, that's right. So that's a variable created by the Census Bureau in which they try to incorporate these other sort of like necessary expenses of renting a unit in order to kind of make comparisons more equal across space.
Okay, great. And we have, I think that's the last of the questions. Let me just check one more place. Oh, Lauren Gibson is asking if this is something that you will be running on a month-to-month basis. And she says that they did a similar analysis looking at BLS, CES data and ACS to estimate rent need, but feels like they will need to redo it each month as policies change. And I think you said that that's your intention to do it, to rerun this frequently as policies change.
Yes, yeah, that's great. And so it sounds like you're doing something very similar to what we do. So if you post a link actually in the chat, I'd love to take a look at it as well. And I'm sure everyone else would. And so yes, the employment data will be updating, every month. And then so we intend to update with more accurate and current employment data, and also just, as soon as there's any talk about what sort of policies people are thinking about to kind of solve this remaining rent need, then that's a natural time also to update it, right? Do these things, will they actually achieve these goals? And by what time of the year, or thinking about, well, when is the next moratorium? When should it be set to expire? March or June? So all these sorts of things, our forecast hopefully can help inform like how effective those things would be.
Right, great. And then just one last question, a really good one, of whether you've thought about it, and is there a way to estimate late fees and other penalties that might be in addition to the back rent that's owed?
That's a really great question. Sort of a difficult one, given sort of the methodology we're using, because a lot of that is sort of specific to even just kind of municipalities. I mean, I know that where we are in Philadelphia, the tenants who lost income as a result of COVID-19 can apply to have those things waived. It's a really interesting question. It might be a little bit difficult for us to incorporate that directly.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And yeah, it's something we've been thinking about too. Would appreciate maybe a continued conversation on that, because as you know, and as people on the call know, late fees and penalties can be substantial, and it's very difficult to estimate because it varies so greatly based on state and local law how much a landlord can apply to late rent, but sometimes it can be a really significant amount. So I think that's all the questions, Davin and Eileen. Thank you so much. We have multiple comments in the Q&A and the chat box about how helpful these data are and this research is. So thank you so much for getting on the call to share it. And we'd love to have you back in the future as you update it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks again.
Thanks, take care. Okay, we're going to turn now to NLIHC's Dan Threet and Mackenzie Pish from Innovation for Justice program at University of Arizona. We published together last week some new research on the costs of evictions, and they're going to share an overview of that today. So Dan and Mackenzie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. This is Dan Threet. I'm a research analyst at the Coalition. We're excited to be able to discuss a recent joint report that we released with the Innovation for Justice program at the University of Arizona on the costs of COVID-19 evictions. And today's national call is sequenced really well. This is complementary in some ways. In contrast with the previous paper, which was focusing on those who are specifically impacted by COVID-related job losses, this research is focused on all possible renters at risk of eviction. So I'll say just a few words about the research note, and then I'll turn things over to the lead author on the report, Mackenzie Pish, who will discuss the details and some of the principal findings. So most of you know that the coalition has been pushing since the spring for strong measures that would keep renters housed during the pandemic, including at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance and a broad eviction moratorium that leaves no impacted households behind. Now, over the last 9 months, the research team has published several short notes explaining why we need emergency rental assistance based on what we know about renters at risk of eviction and housing instability. Survey work from the census, the Household Pulse survey, suggests that millions could be at risk of eviction in the coming months without further aid. And those previous research notes estimated the cost of providing rental assistance to those households. Now, another question that we've been repeatedly asked over the last several months concerns the extent to which we can quantify the associated downstream costs that we would face as a society if we failed to act. Now, obviously, renters themselves would be profoundly harmed, and that's reason enough to act. But mass evictions would have additional costs as well, a detrimental spiraling effect on state and local governments, a strain on public agencies, and on the economy as a whole. The researchers at the Innovation for Justice program have developed a tool called the Cost of Eviction Calculator for estimating some select costs that would be incurred by the broader public should we face an increase in homelessness. And our joint report uses that tool to show national and state level estimates of these downstream costs. The costs of emergency shelter beds, emergency and inpatient medical care, child welfare, and juvenile justice. These are only a few of the known costs of eviction-related homelessness, but the estimates discussed in this report can be understood as a starting point for measuring the downstream costs of evictions. And we hope it will help make an important supplementary argument for the need for emergency rental assistance. I'll go ahead and turn things over to Mackenzie to discuss some of the substantive findings of the research note.
Thank you, Dan. And this is Mackenzie Pish from the Innovation for Justice program. Thank you for that great introduction. I just want to back up a step and remind everyone again that millions of US renters are at risk of eviction. In October, US Census data reveals that 16% of renters were behind on rent. And those rates are even higher for our marginalized and low-income renters. Looking forward, one in four of our renters has no or slight confidence that they can pay next month on time. And renters at all levels are relying on unsustainable resources to meet spending needs. As you see in figure 2, more than half of renters with no confidence are borrowing from families and friends. More than 1/3 are using credit cards and loans, and more than 1/3 are spending down their savings or selling assets. Our report tries to leverage 3 forecasts about the number of households at risk for eviction during COVID. If you can flip to the next screen, you can see that the first model, the lowest model that says Federal Reserve proportional model, assumes that some renters who have no or slight confidence in their ability to pay rent on time will still be able to do so. This model comes from research that was conducted by economists from the Federal Reserve who analyzed a small sample of adults who had responded to the Pulse survey in both the last week of May and the first week of June. Following these renters, they found that 36% of those who reported in May that they had no confidence in their ability to pay next month's rent had subsequently reported that they paid June's rent. They also found that 71% of those with slight confidence, 86% with moderate confidence, and 98% with high confidence subsequently paid. Assuming that these payment probability rates, which were derived from summer survey responses, were still relevant, we calculated the number of renters at risk of eviction by applying these probability rates to week 16 Pulse survey data. And we found that 6.7 million households were at risk of eviction. So that's the lower model. Evicting that many renters could cost upwards of $62,000 in just a select few costs of eviction-related homelessness. But we believe that this number is modest. We believe that renters with no or slight confidence in the ability to pay rent are running out of resources to do so. As we mentioned before and showed you in figure 2, renters are relying on unsustainable means to meet spending needs. So the second and third forecast there Stout Low and Stout High show the number of renters at risk of eviction. Those models were developed by Stout Rees Ross, a global advisory firm, based on data from the Census Household Pulse Survey conducted in mid-September. Stout's lower forecast assumes that all renters who report slight or no confidence in their ability to pay next month's rent are at risk of failing to do so. The higher forecast includes those renters, as well as 1/4 of renters who only have moderate confidence. Looking at both these estimates, nearly 10 million to 14 million US renter households may be at risk of eviction. Evicting that many renters could cost upwards of $129 billion. And if you flip to the next slide, here you can see the cost breakdown for the 5 categories that we measure. You can see that emergency shelter is going to be some of the highest costs, followed by inpatient and emergency medical care, and juvenile delinquency and foster care. As you look at these costs, it's really important to note that these are just 5 of the costs of eviction-related homelessness. Communities will incur other costs related to homelessness. For example, resources will be needed to meet the increased need for longer-term housing assistance, and the cost of child welfare investigations that precede foster care, as well as the cost of arrests in courts that involve juvenile delinquency cases. Moreover, this report does not attempt to estimate the public cost of caring for evicted families who do not end up homeless. Families who are doubling up or finding other ways to stay housed will need services too, and those services will require a lot of financial resources. So these estimates, as Dan mentioned before, are really just a starting point for measuring the cost of evictions, but we think that they paint a pretty dark picture of what's ahead. And regardless of which model you look at, whether you look at the Federal Reserve model or Stout's High, one thing is true, if our leadership doesn't affirmatively take on the economic costs of keeping people housed during the pandemic, we will all collectively bear the economic, social, and community costs of evicting millions of our neighbors. And with that, I think, Dan, maybe you had a closing point.
I'll just call everyone's attention to the links you have on the last slide, as well as the link in the chat to the report itself. So the Innovation for Justice program developed this tool, the cost of eviction calculator, and on their website, you can modify the estimates both of renters at risk and the cost estimates for each of those 5 cost components to be able to produce more local estimates if you have other information you'd like to plug in there. But at that point, I think we can probably pause and take questions if there are any.
Thanks, Dan and Mackenzie. Really, really excellent research and important research. Thanks for the overview. And I just wanted to underscore what Mackenzie said there, which is that this is really a conservative estimate in that not all costs are reflected, and in that the estimate is that about 25% of people who are evicted will become homeless and require these services. And while that's about the percentage typically of people who are evicted and end up in homeless shelters, when we're faced with so many evictions at once, and a person's entire network may be at risk of losing their homes, that number might be much higher, and so the costs would also be much higher. So there's a question, a really important point that Michael Pierce raises about how many people who are at risk of losing their homes will leave before the formal eviction process, and asking whether you have a way of predicting the proportion of people who are at risk of losing their homes in that manner. So they're not formally being evicted, but they're still losing their homes, and there will still be associated costs that result.
That's a fantastic question. I think the starting point for our research note grapples with those households who are at risk as well. What we're doing is just building on the responses to the Household Pulse Survey, whether we're using this more conservative model that stems from economists working at the Federal Reserve or from Stout's model. Both of those are just getting numbers of households at risk on the basis of which renters are saying they have no or slight confidence in their ability to pay rent going forward, or who say they're already behind on their rent. So some portion of those renters may never see a formal eviction filing, but will be intimidated out of their home before the end of the eviction moratorium, or will leave of their own volition. And so presumably a good number of the households that we're talking about here may fall into that category as well.
Thanks, Dan. And another question about whether there's this is from Zoraima Diaz, who's asking if there's a way to estimate the public cost in low-income communities of colors where families are more likely to double up rather than seek shelter.
That's a great question. I think if you visit our online tool, one thing that you could do is raise the estimate for, like, look at your local community and enter in whichever number of renters you think are at risk in your local community. And you can actually change all of the data points to fit your local community and produce estimates just for that community. We haven't currently built in anything to capture marginalized and low-income communities that have higher marginalized and low-income renters. But as Dan mentioned, we are using the household survey as our starting point. So if you have better data for your local community, I think you could start there.
Okay, thanks, Mackenzie. And another question, actually, before I ask the question, I'm going to ask whoever is managing the slides, if you could just go back one slide. Somebody is asking if they can see the slide that shows the cost estimates again. Thank you. And I think last question for now is whether any of the elements that are considered in the cost of eviction relate to impact on credit rating and reporting and the future housing costs that result from poor credit.
That's a good question as well. There are a number of longer term costs that are not included in this estimate as well. So it does not include the damage to credit that might happen to these households and the costs that they will accrue there. It also does not account for longer term medical care needs. And it does not account for the need for longer term housing assistance as well. So the estimates that we have in the report here are costs that we're likely to accrue in the first 12 to 18 months.
Right. Okay, well, thanks, Dan and Mackenzie, thanks so much. There's multiple requests in the chat and Q&A box for the research for this presentation. We'll be sure to share that out with everybody after the call, but thanks for your work on this and thanks for joining today's call.
Thank you.
So I will turn now, and yes, several people have asked whether the slides from these presentations will be available. They are, they will be, and we will send them out after the call together with a recording, a link to the recording of the call itself. So we're going to turn now to another piece of new research on the challenges that small landlords are facing. And we're going to hear from Lori Goodman, who's the Vice President of Housing Finance Policy at Urban Institute. So Lori, thanks so much for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. I'd like to mention that this is joint work with Jung Choi, who's one of my colleagues at Urban. And this is based on a survey by Avail. And we actually work, and Avail is a platform that helps mom and pop landlords manage their units, screen tenants, and collect rents. It periodically surveys its landlords and tenants. And we work with Avail to help design this survey. This was conducted in late October and had about 1,400 landlords answering the questions. And I think what these results are going to show is that an eviction moratorium actually puts a ton of pressure on small landlords. And clearly what we need is some sort of a formal rental assistance program. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Next slide. Perfect. This actually, so one of the questions in the survey was, did you receive, again, the survey was conducted at the end of October. Did you receive full rent in September? And do you expect to receive full rent in October? So 35% of the landlords did not receive full rent in September, and 38% didn't expect to do so in October. Now, remember, these are small landlords. About 36% of them earn the majority of their income from rental properties. They may own 1 or 2 properties. 72% of these landlords have a mortgage. They did not receive full rental income in September, the top 3 reasons were 77% said tenants didn't or can't pay in full, 28.5% said the units were vacant, and 13% offered tenants a discount, or another 9% offered tenants a rent deferment. So the biggest category was tenants didn't or can't pay in full, followed by a very high percentage of those with vacant units. And 19% of them said vacancies had increased since COVID-19 started in response to another question. So what are the consequences of this? Next slide, please. So 31% of landlords overall said they felt more pressure to sell their properties. Of those who received full payment in September, only 17% felt pressure to sell. Of those that didn't receive full payment in September, 57% felt pressure to sell. So you're thinking, well, that's pretty logical. Overall, those who didn't receive full payment would feel the pressure a lot more. But there are 2 additional factors that come into play. The first is income level, and the second is, do you have a mortgage? So of those who earn less, of those whose total income was less than $50,000, 51% felt with a mortgage, 51% felt increased pressure to sell. Of those with 50 to 100,000, 43% felt increased pressure to sell. Without a mortgage, the numbers were a little bit lower, but still quite high. So the share of landlords experiencing increased pressure to sell for those who earn overall incomes of less than 100,000 was pretty strong, and for those who have incomes of less than 50,000, including what they own from their properties, was very, very strong. Next slide, please. One long-term consequence of this is if your tenants aren't paying the rent, one temptation that landlords have is to impose stricter screening criteria on future tenants. And in fact, we're seeing exactly that. You can see for Black landlords and Hispanic landlords, about 42% impose stricter screening, 35% of white, 35.4% of white landlords, and about closer to 36% overall. Of those that had tightened their credit, 30% are requiring higher credit scores, 50% are requiring a higher income relative to payment ratio. And that seems to be pretty constant, regardless of the race, ethnicity of the landlord. One place that we're seeing a very interesting difference is that 50% of Black and Latino landlords are imposing a more thorough screening of previous evictions versus only 35% of white landlords. And we puzzled over this and thought, well, why would Black and Latino landlords be more apt to impose a more thorough screening of previous evictions? And we believe it's because Black and Hispanic landlords are more likely to own 2 to 4 unit properties, which disproportionately serve lower income renters with higher eviction rates. They're disproportionately in communities with lower income renters with higher eviction rates. So the tighter screening is something that is coming through across all landlords, and even more prominently among Black and Hispanic landlords than among white landlords. Now, we think this is really important because basically it shows that pressure on landlords is growing fairly considerably and will continue to grow more. In response to additional questions, 37% of landlords anticipate increasing financial burden in the remaining few months of this year because of the extension of the federal eviction moratorium. And about 35% said they expect the burden to increase at the end of the year due to the expiration of the extended unemployment insurance benefits. So the situation is going to get worse unless there is a formal rental assistance program passed. And what this does, the financial pressure on mom and pop landlords means that you're selling that are more affordable than those owned by institutional investors, which is going to create in the long run a loss of affordable units. Even if the property isn't bought by an institutional investor, it's going to be bought by another mom and pop that is more apt to do a renovation. Bottom line, the eviction moratoriums aren't the long-term answer. You need more financial support in the form of long-term rental assistance. So with that, let me conclude and turn it over for questions.
Great, thanks, Lori. It's really interesting and helpful research. You said there that I think it was of the landlords who have concerns that there were 19% vacancies, and there's a question about how that vacancy rate compares to pre-COVID levels.
19% said that their vacancies had increased since COVID-19.
Right, and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these are people who own 1 unit or 2 units. So, you know, kind of in the aggregate, it's probably a reasonable answer. But remember, these aren't people who own thousands of units. So, you know, it's important to keep in mind the audience that's answering this question.
Sure, so it's a hit on their income if they have 1 vacant unit, if they only
exactly. It may be all of their income in many cases.
Right, right. There's a question about, well, here's one about, do you find any evidence of real estate tax relief? I'm not sure exactly what that means. Josephine, maybe you can add a little bit more to your question so we're a little clearer on what you're asking. But Lori, I'm wondering certainly we're seeing increased self-reporting on pressure to sell properties. Are there any data, any trends that we're seeing of increased sale of properties yet?
No, it's sort of hard to tell exactly who's selling properties, but no, I mean, you see inventories at very, very, very low levels, sort of month supply in single family homes is sort of 2.7 months, sort of a 20-year low. So you're not seeing evidence of forced selling yet. It's something that you know, we will see if this goes on.
Right. Okay.
And in terms of tax relief, where, you know, again, there may be some communities that are offering tax relief. I'm not aware of it. If someone is aware of it, shoot me an email because it's something that we could ask on their next survey.
Okay, we can share follow-up information on that. There's a question about what type of assistance should local governments think about prioritizing for this subset of landlords? I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Sorry. Tax relief would certainly help, but longer term, I mean, you need a national rental assistance program. This is a landlord problem, but it's a landlord problem stemming from a tenant problem.
Right, and that's something that everybody on this call is certainly making every effort to achieve rental assistance, as I know many of you at Urban are as well. So I think that's all the questions, Lori. Thanks so much for doing this research and for sharing it on today's call.
Sure, well, thank you very much for having me here today. Take care.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye. All right, we're going to turn now to our field updates. And the first is from Dina Hassan, who's Director of Policy and Program Support at the DC Department of Human Services. Dina, I'll turn to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me on this call to share a program that I'm really excited about. It's an inclusive intervention within the district's COVID response that was built and formed from partnerships with healthcare, shelter and outreach providers, and the persons that we serve. This intervention is called what we affectionately have acronymed because we do everything in acronyms in government. It's called the PEPV program, which stands for the Pandemic Emergency Program for Medically Vulnerable Individuals. And this is our proactive strategy to reduce exposure to COVID-19 among persons experiencing homelessness that are thought to be at greatest risk of severe complication and even death if they contract the virus. Before I continue with talking about our PEPV intervention, I'd like to share what it's not. And I think that sometimes it's confused with another intervention that we have, which is our affectionately called ISAC sites, which is our sites that are for isolation and quarantine. So for individuals that are exposed to coronavirus or have tested positive for COVID and cannot isolate safely, especially like those that rely on shelter. So PEPV is different than our ISAC site. So the ISAC site was launched, program was launched in March through the mayor's emergency powers. And different than our housing continuum under our law that stood those up, this is specifically for DC's COVID response. Everyone that's placed at a PEPV site is tested before they are placed. And there are on-site services for clients that are there, including housing case managers that help clients develop housing plans for when they transition from PEPV. There's also on-site outpatient primary care and behavioral health care. When we talk about PEPV, we also want to highlight that PEPV is not a substitute for low bear shelter. It's also not a substitute for respite care, long-term health care, or community residential facility. So we have 3 PEPV sites. The first one was launched in March at the beginning of the public health emergency. We launched our second one in May, and then we recently launched our third one last month in October. There are about 417 rooms that we have at PEPV, and we'll talk about some of our latest evolution with PEPV later, which speaks to why our current census at PEPV is 540 individuals. Of those at PEPV, 246 of our clients are matched to permanent housing programs, and thus far, 66 people have exited PEPV to permanent housing. PEPV has evolved as the public has learned and as our experts have learned more about what COVID is, how it's transmitted, and effective ways to protect our populations from getting it. So I wanted to also share some things that have changed with our PEPV process over the last couple of months. That's been informed by CDC guidance and our local health experts, also informed by lessons learned from other states, and then also what we've learned by running these programs over the past 8 or so months. So the first part of PEPV that's changed or evolved is the eligibility criteria. When we first launched PEPV, we wanted to make sure that we had individuals at PEPV that were at highest risk of severe health outcomes. So we placed individuals there that were over 80 years old or over 70 years old with severe lung disease or uncontrolled diabetes, and then with any age with a certain small subset of severe chronic health conditions. As the CDC's broadened its range of individuals that were at risk of severe health outcomes, so did we. And we opened our PEPV sites to those that were 65 years old or of any age, and we expanded our list of chronic health conditions that were eligible, including adding obesity on there, chronic kidney disease, et cetera. And then our current eligibility criteria, which reflects CDC's guidance, is open to anyone who is over 55 years old or any age with a longer list of chronic health conditions, including cerebral vascular disease, neurologic disease, et cetera. As we surveyed how other states responded to the public health emergency, We particularly looked at New York and Connecticut to see how they served more people. And one thing that we saw is that they actually had room sharing at their hotels. And they used hotels to help protect persons experiencing homelessness from COVID. Initially, when we first launched Pet V, we had individuals in single room, but now we have individuals that share rooms. And we're doing this to fully leverage this Pet V intervention to help as many people as possible. When people are matched to rooms, we use a number of criteria. First, client preference, and then we look at a number of things, including gender, if the lifestyles are similar. So if you have a person who leaves, who needs to work, or a person who's only early riser, we also look at previous health conditions, current health conditions, so that we can make a really good match and that our clients are as comfortable as they can be in our Pet V setting. We have learned through this as we've gone through double occupancy and have case managers that are asked clients how they're doing with their roommates. Because we have on-site behavioral health services there, we do de-escalation, and we have our behavioral health specialists talking with clients to help them live well with another person in the hotel room. We've also adapted our alcohol policy. In some states that had double occupancy, they did not allow alcohol on site, but we chose to allow a limited number of alcohol, a limited volume of alcohol at our Pet V sites, because we really want to help our clients stay at Pet V as much as possible and not feel the urge to leave and go outside, which increases risk of exposure. So right now, clients have a maximum of 2 12-ounce bottles of beer or wine that they're allowed to bring on site. And that's working pretty well. And then for our on-site healthcare services, another change that we've made, which I think reflects what we've learned over the last couple of months, is that when we first launched Pet V, we had a really nurse-intensive approach to services, where we had one of our biggest healthcare providers, Unity Healthcare, doing daily wellness checks on individuals. And after doing that for a couple of months, and after listening to our clients, we found that some of the individuals there really didn't need that level of medical care. So we then transitioned to more of a clinic-based model, where we have MDs and RNs on site from 8 to 4, Monday through Friday. And then for a smaller subset of our clients, we have clinicians there 7 days a week. And those are individuals that are really in need of respite care. They need help with daily pricks, where they need help with meeting their activities of daily living, et cetera. And I think that's it. So we continue to evolve and learn from the program. And we're happy to share and answer questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much. That's really good work, and I appreciate you sharing it. There are a few questions. One, asking about how COVID testing intersects with your co-housing program. Are you testing people before, after, during their stay?
Yeah. So before any person is placed at a Pet V site, they receive a rapid test. So it's a part of the intake process, where when a client is referred to Pet V, we have our clinicians review their health history to make sure they qualify for Pet V. We then arrange transportation from the outreach, wherever a person is, shelter, outreach, wherever they are. They're brought to the Pet V site, and then they're tested. The tests take about 10 minutes to receive the results. And then after that, we have our clinicians do a quick workup on clients to see if they have any immediate medications that they need, and to really understand what their healthcare needs are. And then the client is escorted to their room.
Great. And another question from Bridget Duran, who's asking where clients come from. How do they find you? How do they access this program?
Yeah, so we've put out through our website, via biweekly calls, a number of communication vehicles, what Pet V is, to share the message and to talk about this resource in DC. hospitals, shelters, outreach providers, and now clients themselves can refer themselves to Pet V. We have a hot link that they can tap on to complete the referral form. And in the referral form, the person completing it attests to their age, attests to having a chronic condition. They also share if they have mobility issues, et cetera. That goes to our healthcare clinicians that then review to see if they meet Pet V eligibility criteria. For clients that don't have access to Wi-Fi, don't have access to internet, they can also call one of our team members to help them complete the referral form.
Thank you. And somebody's asking, can you remind us what Pet V stands for?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's the Pandemic Emergency Program for Medically Vulnerable Individuals.
Great. And somebody's asking whether in the chronic conditions that you consider, whether traumatic brain injury is one of them.
No, we don't have TBI on here. Right now it is lung disease, asthma, heart conditions that are severe and uncontrolled. We have those that are immunocompromised, diabetes, liver disease, chronic kidney disease, obesity defined as BMI over 40, sickle cell disease, hypertension, or high blood pressure. But we don't have TBI specifically located or identified on here.
Okay. And how are you funding this work? What are the funding sources?
We use FEMA funds.
Okay. So FEMA is reimbursing for the non-congregate shelter costs.
Right.
Okay. And a question about when you are matching the Pet V clients with permanent housing, how are you accessing that permanent housing?
So the clients that are at Pet V are matched to housing through our coordinated entry process. So because Pet V is for those experiencing homelessness, individuals that access our homeless services go through our coordinated or CAP process. And through the CAP process, if they meet the criteria for permanent housing, they're matched to permanent housing.
Okay, great. And then a last question is if you could repeat the numbers again, the number of hotel rooms that you're using and the number of individuals that are part of the program.
Sure. So we have 3 Pet V sites. Our most recent Pet V site was opened in October. This equates to 417 rooms that can be occupied by our clients. Some of these rooms can be used for a double occupancy. And right now our current census is 540. I would invite, and I can actually put it in the chat box, that we use a storyboard on our website that gives updates like this. And our website also provides the slide decks that we use on our biweekly partner calls, where our director goes over all of our updates regarding COVID response, including updates on our ISAC and Pet V sites.
Oh, great.
I'll drop that in the chat.
Yeah, please do. And we'll share that back out too with our network. That'd be really helpful. Great, Dina, thank you so much. This has been so interesting and helpful. I appreciate you joining, and thanks for all your great work.
Thank you.
All right, and now we'll turn to our next field update, which comes from Gregory Shin from Oklahoma Coalition for Affordable Housing and the Oklahoma Governor's Interagency Council on Homelessness. Gregory, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for having me here today. And it's really great to see all of the reports and see all the data, which is really critical for us to continue making advocacy efforts and policy decisions. So I want to give a few updates of what's going on across Oklahoma. Currently, our unsheltered count has risen significantly in both Tulsa and Oklahoma City due to fewer people being allowed in the existing congregate shelters and due to evictions that have been granted during the pandemic. That includes about 900 evictions in Oklahoma City during the pandemic. Of course, most of those are not for non-payment of rent, they're for other reasons, but evictions are still occurring, which is adding to the number of homeless and displaced families and individuals. In Oklahoma City, the city is currently working to use $1 million in ESG CARES funding to open a new emergency winter shelter through at least March 31st of 2021. This should open about 150 new beds at a vacant school building that's been identified. It's a little bit complex, but we're working to open that as quickly as we possibly can. Also in Oklahoma City, the Mayor's Task Force on Homelessness is working in various subcommittees to implement the new strategic plan to end homelessness, which has priorities that are focused on different subpopulations and policy reform issues. And this includes the implementation of the Metropolitan Area Projects number 4, known as MAPS 4, which will generate over $900 million in the next several years. $50 million of that is dedicated to affordable housing and homelessness. 74% of the entire fund of $900 million is dedicated to social services projects. And these projects should take place within the next 18 months. They were voted on by the taxpayers prior to the pandemic, but now, of course, they have an even greater urgency. As the projects are awarded, the funding will already be in hand via the sales tax. In Tulsa, the city is in the first year of a new 5-year strategic plan to end homelessness. The city has opened up a new temporary overflow shelter through at least June 1st of 2021 using CARES funding, and over 6,000 guests have been to the new shelter, which is averaging around 125 people in the daytime and 55 people overnight. The city has also awarded over $4 million in ESG CARES funding, and this includes a new rapid rehousing program for over $2 million to help house individuals from the new overflow shelter and the temporary hotel, which is being used to help COVID positive homeless individuals who are recovered and are then transitioning into permanent housing. We're also working in Tulsa on affordable housing acquisition using opportunities through the CDBG CARES funding that's available to expand access to vulnerable populations. Statewide, thousands of families have accessed emergency rental assistance programs made available through CARES funding and private foundation funding. These applications are still being processed, and landlords are receiving the rent payments through providers in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, as well as the State Department of Commerce. Currently, about $6.5 million has been paid out. With the number of current applications still in processing, it's likely to go over $10 million by the end of the process on December 17th. The Oklahoma Governor's Interagency Council on Homelessness is also overseeing the implementation of a new 5-year state plan, and we're currently holding regional discharge planning forums with all 8 continuums of care across the state. These forums are being held on Zoom. 3 forums have been conducted and participation is strong. There are 5 more that are planned in December, January, and February. And this topic is of great importance because people keep getting discharged to homelessness from correctional facilities, hospitals, and other sources during the pandemic. They keep getting out and they have nowhere to go. So we're having hospitals and other entities attend these discharge planning forums to help come up with solution-focused, problem-solving topics that we can implement during the pandemic and after. Also in the state, the HUD CPD director is convening an all-grantee meeting in the next couple of weeks to discuss the end of the eviction moratorium on December 31st. I did see that the Biden administration may extend that eviction moratorium. That would be great, but in the meantime, we have to prepare for the end of that, and then what can we use the ESG funds for prevention as quickly as possible at that time. That's all I have right now, and I'm happy to take any questions that there may be.
Thank you, Gregory. I really appreciate that very helpful update, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. Jerry asked a question about how you're thinking about moving into 2021 and whether the governor is advocating for any additional federal COVID relief?
At this time, our governor is not advocating for additional federal relief. There are many other advocacy organizations who disagree with that and would encourage our governor to accept additional federal resources should they be granted through a new package. We certainly need it. There are thousands and thousands of families that continue to be at risk. As I said, our unsheltered count is increasing, not decreasing.
Right. Right. Well, we're certainly with you on working to get additional resources. Oh, another question is, so what is your governor's plan if not advocating for more resources? What's the governor's plan to respond to the needs?
Well, I know that currently I'm not inside the cabinet, of course, but I do know that they're still planning all the projects to be allocated with the remaining funds through the first tranches of funding from the CARES Act. And those projects are still being awarded. We do have some affordable housing projects that we hope get selected, but he's still trying to spend all of the money. It's my understanding up to this point that he is still trying to spend all the money that is currently has already been allocated. But of course, that's not going to be enough, as I already said.
Right, right. Well, certainly that is a priority, though, to get that money spent, especially if it's funded through the Coronavirus Relief Fund dollars, because those expire at the end of the year, and we wouldn't want to see any needed funds be swept back to the Treasury. So, Gregory, thanks so much. I really appreciate you joining the call.
Thank you.
Take care. All right, and now I will turn to our last speaker for today's call, which is Sarah Sadian from NLIHC, to give us an update on COVID relief package discussions on Capitol Hill. Sarah, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much. First, I want to thank everybody for participating in last week's National Call-In Day. Now really is the time, as Diane mentioned at the top of the call, to be pressing our members of Congress, to be putting pressure on them to do something in the lame duck and not to wait until next year to start negotiating a package. There seems to be more and more pressure building for passing something during the lame duck, although it seems like the conversation is indicating that that package will be a lot smaller than what we had hoped for. We know that Speaker Pelosi, Senator Schumer, and President-elect Biden met last Friday, to talk about their plan for responding to COVID. You know, publicly, they're still pushing for the $2.2 trillion package that Democrats had offered prior to the election. But we're also hearing that Biden and other folks, both moderate Democrats and progressives, are putting on pressure to get something done, which could be a down payment for future legislation in 2021. We've also seen more Republicans speak publicly about the need for a bill. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin met last week with Republicans in Congress about a relief package, and Senator Portman said last week that he's working on a bipartisan agreement on some limited relief. We've weighed in with his office about the need for housing and homelessness resources, but there's not an indication right now that his plan would include those funds. That being said, Senator Schumer has said that they're seeing a little bit of a breakthrough in terms of restarting those conversations, and so those are all positive signs that we want to see continue, but we're still a ways away from seeing a deal get reached. There is a possibility that a relief package could be added to a spending bill. We do see a lot of progress actually in terms of spending bills in the last couple of weeks. We know that last Thursday, staffers for Senator McConnell and Schumer, Pelosi and McCarthy all met to talk about spending bills and to try to decide on top line spending amounts for each bill, including the transportation and HUD bill. Once they have those top numbers agreed to, then the committee can start hashing out the differences between the House and Senate bills. And I'll ask if one of my colleagues can share our analysis from the Senate bills that were released earlier this month. There are some still challenges, though, on the spending package. I think people are not entirely certain that President Trump will sign a spending agreement. We know that fights over wall funding are likely to come up again. And then over this weekend, there was some indication by House Republicans and possibly the White House that they would oppose an agreement that was reached between congressional Democrats and Republicans to exclude veterans' health programs from budget caps that have been really hard for Congress to work with. So if those VA programs are not exempted from budget caps, it would be extremely difficult to see that other programs, including housing programs, receive the funding that they need. It's unclear just how much of a sticking point this will be, so we're weighing in with appropriators and keeping a close eye on that. But despite those challenges, lawmakers seem to be optimistic about getting something done. There's been a lot of comments from leaders on both sides of the aisle that they don't want to see a government shutdown. So that's all good. Also, I wanted to give a quick update about some disaster recovery bills. Last Tuesday, actually, shortly after our call ended, the House passed two bills that is supported by this coalition. The first is the Housing Survivors of Major Disasters Act, and I'll share the bill numbers in the chat box in a second. That bill would address some major title documentation issues that have resulted in tens of thousands of eligible disaster survivors to be denied assistance. That fixes that issue. That was passed out of the House. There was also a FEMA Assistance Relief Act. Again, I'll share the bill numbers in a second. That would increase the federal cost share for emergency assistance related to COVID relief and other disasters, which is really it's very urgently needed given the strains on state and local budgets. We are pushing for that to be included as any end of year package. We've been told by House committee staff that they're also pushing for this, but they aren't exactly sure where the Senate stands on those bills. They were supposed to have a call last week to hash out some of those differences and see what could move forward, but we haven't heard back from them just yet. So if you're reaching out to your senator's offices about a relief package, you might also want to reach out to them about those bills. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Diane.
Great, Sarah. Before you go, there's a few questions about whether there are any efforts and any hope for extending the deadline for unexpended CARES Act, especially through the CRF. So can you address what we know and what we're doing on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is definitely something that we've heard from a lot of our partners about, and I think we've weighed in with congressional staff. I know lots of other people have weighed in with them too. It's unfortunately been tied up into larger negotiations about state and local fiscal relief. We know that Democrats are really pushing for extra dollars. That's their number one ask going into these negotiations. And I think there's some concern on their part that a focus on extending the deadline would undermine their argument for more money. On the Republican side, they prefer extending the deadline and maybe providing a little bit more flexibility rather than giving new resources. And so what we're trying to do is emphasize to them that all of these resources are incredibly important and that CRF money could be used to help keep people housed, that we don't want to see those dollars returned back to Treasury if they're not spent by the deadline, but that we also realistically need more emergency rental assistance, of course, but also state and local relief funds. So unfortunately, it's been tied up into these larger debates, but we're keeping a very close eye on it. And we know that we've reached out and many other folks have reached out too.
Great, thanks for the update, Sarah. And just a few final notes before we end the call. Somebody was asking about how much total CRF funds are unexpended. I'm not sure about the total. If any of my coworkers know, they can add it into the chat box. But as you all know, we've been tracking emergency rental assistance programs and funding for those programs throughout the country. Last count, I think we're up to 480 emergency rental assistance programs that we're tracking. And within those programs, of the ones that are funded through CRF dollars, there is, I believe, $364 million in unspent CRF funds that are at risk of being reverted back to Treasury at the end of the year. So So it certainly is a challenge, a concern, because while that money is a drop in the bucket compared to the overall need, that's money that can keep people housed tonight and tomorrow night and through the winter. So we are going to keep working to try to get that deadline extended in Congress. And as for the CDC eviction moratorium, I mentioned all of the ways that we are working to get it extended or re-implemented. I think we'll do a sign-on letter soon to the CDC, get a really broad sign-on letter of partners from housing and beyond fields to really urge the CDC to act on their own and extend that eviction moratorium. So be on the lookout for that. And that's it for today's call. So I hope you all have a really safe and healthy Thanksgiving. Please wear your masks. And we'll be back again next Monday. So we'll talk to you all again on Monday. And in the meantime, I hope you all stay well. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.